Case 1. Chad Duerman. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon in Monroe Township, a quiet corner of Clermont County, Ohio. Neighbors went about their routines. Children played in yards. Nothing suggested that within minutes, 3 young boys would lose their lives at the hands of the person who should have protected them most. Chad Duerman was 33 years old, a father of 3 sons who lived what appeared to be a typical suburban life. To those who knew the family, there was little that stood out as alarming. But on June 15, 2023, Duerman carried out an act so calculated and brutal that it would leave investigators struggling to comprehend how a father could do such a thing to his own children. The boys were young. Clayton was 7, Hunter was 4, Chase was only 3. They lived with their father, their mother Laura, and their older stepsister in a home that should have been a place of safety. Instead, it became the scene of an execution. Around 4 p.m. that day, Duerman retrieved a rifle. What happened next unfolded in broad daylight, with witnesses present who would carry the trauma of what they saw for the rest of their lives. Duerman shot Clayton first. The 7-year-old fell. Hunter, realizing something terrible was happening, tried to run. His mother, Laura, tried desperately to intervene, to stop what was unfolding, but Duerman turned the gun on her. She was shot in the hand. The violence didn't stop. Hunter made it outside, running across the yard in a desperate attempt to escape. Duerman followed. He hunted his own son down and shot him. The 4-year-old's life ended in the family's front yard. Inside the chaos, the boy's teenage stepsister grabbed 3-year-old Chase. She tried to run, tried to get him away from the house, away from the horror that had already claimed his brothers. But Duerman confronted her. He pointed the rifle at her head and told her to put Chase down. Terrified, crying, she had no choice. She set the boy down. Duerman had run out of ammunition. He reloaded. Then he shot Chase. The 3-year-old, who moments before had been in his sister's arms, was killed. By the time deputies arrived at the scene, all 3 boys were dead. Laura Duerman had been shot trying to protect her children. Her daughter had witnessed all of it and been forced at gunpoint to release the youngest boy to his death. Officers found Duerman sitting calmly outside the home. The rifle was beside him on the ground. Investigators began piecing together not just what happened, but why. Duerman was arrested immediately. In the hours and days that followed, he told authorities something that made the crime even more chilling. He said he had been thinking about killing his sons for months. The planning wasn't impulsive, it wasn't a sudden snap. He admitted the thought had weighed on him so heavily that he hadn't been able to sleep for days. Clermont County Prosecutor Mark Takulve described the scene as one of the most disturbing his office had encountered. The brutality wasn't just in the act itself, but in the methodical way Duerman carried it out. He chased Hunter down when the boy ran. He forced his stepdaughter to release Chase at gunpoint. He reloaded when he ran out of bullets. Every action was deliberate. The legal proceedings moved forward with shocking speed. Duerman was charged with 9 counts of aggravated murder and other charges including kidnapping and felonious assault. Prosecutors made it clear they were prepared to seek the death penalty if the case went to trial. But there would be no trial. In August 2024, Chad Duerman stood in court and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder and 2 counts of felonious assault. The plea deal had been reached in consultation with Laura Duerman, the boy's mother. For her, the decision was about avoiding further trauma. Prosecutor Takulve explained that putting the surviving family members through a lengthy trial would be an act of cruelty toward them. The guarantee that Duerman would spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of release was, in their view, the appropriate resolution. Judge Richard Ferencz sentenced Duerman to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count of murder, to be served consecutively. The message was clear: Duerman would die in prison. Laura Duerman had her statement read in court. She described the impossible grief of losing all three of her sons. She acknowledged that no punishment could bring Clayton, Hunter, and Chase back, but knowing that Dorman would never walk free again provided some measure of closure. The guarantee of his permanent removal from society was what she needed to begin trying to rebuild what was left of her shattered life. The case sent shockwaves through Monroe Township and beyond. How does a father go from thinking about harming his children to actually carrying out their executions? Duerman's own admission that he had been planning it for months raised urgent questions about whether there had been warning signs that were missed or ignored. Mental health professionals pointed out that his claim of not sleeping for days suggested a possible psychiatric crisis, but it remained unclear whether anyone around him had noticed his deterioration. The boy's school, friends, and extended family struggled to make sense of the loss. 3 young lives full of potential had been erased in minutes. Clayton would never reach his 8th birthday. Hunter and Chase would never grow old enough to attend school together. The case became a focal point for discussions about family annihilation and the warning signs that sometimes precede such tragedies. While Dorman appeared to be a typical suburban father, his internal state had clearly spiraled into something dark and dangerous. Experts emphasize that thoughts of harming one's children, insomnia lasting days, and increasingly erratic behavior are red flags that require immediate intervention. For the surviving family members, life will never be the same. Laura Dorman lost her 3 sons and nearly her own life. The teenage stepdaughter will carry the trauma of being forced to release Chase at gunpoint, knowing what would happen next. Both will live with the knowledge that they witnessed the murders and were powerless to stop them. Today, Chad Dorman sits in an Ohio state prison where he will spend the rest of his life. There is no parole. There is no second chance. The man who systematically executed his 3 sons in broad daylight will die behind bars. The names Clayton, Hunter, and Chase Dorman remain a reminder of 3 innocent children whose lives were stolen by the person who should have loved them most. Their story forces an uncomfortable truth into public conversation. Sometimes the greatest danger to children comes not from strangers, but from within their own homes. Recognizing the signs, intervening before tragedy strikes, and ensuring that those experiencing mental health crises get help remain critical challenges in preventing such horrors from happening again. Case 2. Adam Price. The weekend of May 15, 2021, should have been a routine custody exchange. Adam Price, 35, was scheduled to have his 2 children for the weekend at his home in Bellevue, Nebraska. Emily was 5 years old. Theodore was 3. Their parents were in the middle of a divorce, and like many separated families, they were navigating the complicated reality of shared custody and split households. Mary Nielsen, the children's mother, lived in Illinois. The distance added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. But Nielsen trusted that her children would be safe during their father's visitation time. She had no reason to believe otherwise. What happened that weekend would shatter that trust forever. Adam Price had been planning. In the days leading up to the children's visit, he made a series of deliberate moves that suggested he knew exactly what he was going to do. He withdrew $1,500 in cash from local ATMs. He took out the trash and recyclables days before the scheduled pickup, an unusual action that would later strike investigators as significant. He was tying up loose ends. On the evening of May 15th or early morning hours of May 16th, Price smothered Emily and Theodore to death in their beds. The children were asleep. They likely never knew what was happening. Price used his hands to suffocate them, one by one, in the home where they should have been protected. After killing his children, Price didn't call for help. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, he left the house, got in his car, and started driving west. Mary Nielsen tried to reach her children throughout the weekend. When her calls and messages went unanswered, concern turned to alarm. She asked friends to go to Price's home and check on the children. When those friends arrived on May 16th and entered the house, they found Emily and Theodore dead in their beds. The 911 call was devastating. Nielsen's friends had discovered the worst possible outcome. Police arrived to find the two small bodies and no sign of Adam Price. He was gone. Investigators immediately began piecing together Price's movements. Security footage and financial records showed his path. He had been captured on camera in the days before the murders, moving through his daily routines with an eerie normalcy. After the killings, he had gotten into his vehicle and driven away from Bellevue. Price's destination was California, more than 1,400 miles away. The drive takes roughly 23 hours straight through. Price made the journey, crossing multiple state lines while his children's bodies lay undiscovered in his Bellevue home. When he reached California, specifically the area around Pacifica, just south of San Francisco, Price did something that would become a key part of the investigation. He sought out priests. Using a pseudonym, he approached Catholic clergy and confessed to killing his children. One priest in California testified later that Price, calling himself by a false name, admitted he had murdered Emily and Theodore. When the priest questioned why Price had done such a thing, Price offered no clear answer. He seemed lost, detached, searching for something that confession could not provide. By May 16th, law enforcement had issued a warrant for Price's arrest. License plate readers caught his vehicle traveling through Nevada on its westward path. On the evening of May 16th, authorities located Price in Pacifica, California. He was arrested without incident. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The timeline was clear. The children's bodies had been found in his home during his custody weekend. He had fled across the country. He had confessed to priests, even while using a false identity. Investigators searched his digital devices and found searches and activities that painted a picture of premeditation. Price was extradited back to Nebraska to face charges. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution built a case showing not just that Price had killed his children, but that he had planned to do so and had taken steps to flee afterward. The trial, which finally took place in February 2024, lasted several days. Jurors heard testimony from the friends who discovered the children's bodies. They heard from Mary Nielsen, who spoke about the pain of losing both of her children and the horror of knowing they died at their father's hands during what should have been a safe visit. They heard from the detective who pieced together Price's movements based on video evidence and financial records. They heard from a California priest about Price's confession. Throughout the trial, Price showed little emotion. His defense attorneys struggled to explain his actions. There was no claim of insanity. There was no alternative theory of the crime. The evidence was simply too strong. The jury deliberated for approximately 2.5 hours. On February 29, 2024, they returned a verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing in May 2024, Judge Richard Thompson asked Price if he had anything to say. The courtroom was silent. Price paused for about 15 seconds before speaking. His words were brief: "Just that I always have and always will love my wife and kids." The statement rang hollow. His actions had been the opposite of love. He had taken their lives, stolen their futures, and destroyed their mother's world. Judge Thompson sentenced Adam Price to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each murder, the sentences to run consecutively. Price was immediately transferred from the Sarpy County Jail to the Nebraska Department of Correctional Services Reception and Treatment Center in Lincoln, where he would be evaluated before being sent to a permanent facility. Mary Nielsen watched the sentencing via Zoom from Illinois. She had already lost her children. Now she had to face the reality that their father would spend the rest of his life in prison for killing them. Sarpy County Prosecutor Gage Cobb spoke after the sentencing, saying that nothing would make the nightmare go away. Cobb said. Quote, 2. The case raised difficult questions about the systems meant to protect children during custody disputes. Nielsen had reached out when she couldn't contact her children, and friends had responded by checking the home. But by then, it was too late. Police had actually been to Price's home earlier for a wellness check at Nielsen's request, but without enough evidence to justify forcing entry, they left. Hours later, the children's bodies were discovered when friends entered the home with Nielsen's permission. The tragedy highlighted how custody exchanges can be vulnerable moments, particularly when divorce proceedings are contentious. Price's behavior in the days before the murders suggested he was planning something, but the people around him didn't realize what was coming until it was too late. The religious element of the case added another layer of complexity. Price felt betrayed by his church, according to testimony from a California detective who interviewed him. Yet when he fled after killing his children, he sought out priests to confess. He wanted absolution, forgiveness, some spiritual reckoning with what he had done. But he used a false name, as if the confession itself was just another layer of the deception he had constructed. Today, Adam Price remains in the Nebraska prison system, where he will spend the rest of his natural life. There is no possibility of parole. There is no path to freedom. The man who smothered his 5-year-old daughter and 3-year-old son to death, then drove across the country seeking forgiveness while using a fake identity, will die behind bars. Emily and Theodore Price should be in elementary school now. Emily would be turning 9, Theodore would be 6. Instead, their lives ended in their beds during a weekend visit with their father. Their mother lives with the knowledge that she sent them for a routine custody exchange and never saw them alive again. The case of Adam Price serves as a grim reminder that the end of a marriage can sometimes bring out the worst in people, and that children caught in the middle are the most vulnerable. It underscores the importance of recognizing warning signs, improving communication between jurisdictions during custody disputes, and ensuring that wellness checks have the authority and resources needed to actually protect children at risk. For Emily and Theodore, those protections came too late. Case 3. Jason Carroll's. The note was brief, cruel, and explicit in its intent. If I can't have them, neither can you. Those words, left behind on June 13, 2022, in a home in Round Lake Beach, Illinois, revealed the darkest kind of revenge. Jason Carroll's, 36, had just drowned his 3 young children in a bathtub. The note was meant for his estranged wife, Deborah Berg. The message was clear. He had turned their children into weapons in their marital conflict, and the ultimate victims were 3 innocent lives. Bryant was 5 years old, Cassidy was 3, Gideon was only 2. They were spending the weekend with their father, a routine custody arrangement that followed the separation of their parents. Carls and Berg were no longer together, but they shared custody of the children. That weekend, it was Carol's turn to have them. The couple's separation had been difficult. Like many divorces involving young children, the custody arrangement added stress to an already painful situation. But nothing in the preceding days suggested that Carroll's was planning to commit an act of such absolute brutality. On the morning of June 13th, Deborah Berg went to the family home on Camden Lane to pick up the children. What she found inside would haunt her forever. All 3 children were dead in the bathtub. Bryant, Cassidy, and Gideon had been drowned. Their small bodies were still in the water. And next to them was the note from Carroll's, making it clear this was not an accident, not a moment of lost control, but a deliberate act of vengeance directed at their mother. Berg immediately called 911. The horror in her voice was evident to dispatchers as she tried to explain what she had discovered. Police and emergency responders rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. The children were gone, and Jason Carroll's had fled. Authorities issued an immediate alert. Carroll's was dangerous, armed with rage, and on the run. Within hours, Illinois state troopers spotted his vehicle on Interstate 57 in the southern suburbs of Chicago. When they attempted to stop him, Carroll's refused to pull over. What followed was a 17-minute high-speed chase. Carroll's led troopers on a pursuit through multiple jurisdictions, weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds. The chase finally ended when troopers successfully stopped his vehicle. Carroll's was taken into custody without further incident. The arrest marked the beginning of a legal process that would take nearly 2 years to reach its conclusion. Carroll's was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The children had been found in his home during his custody weekend. The note he left explicitly stated his motive. There was no question about what had happened, only the question of how the legal system would address it. Lake County prosecutors described the case as one of the most devastating they had handled. State's Attorney Eric Reinhart spoke about the impact on the family and the community. The law enforcement officers from Round Lake Beach had performed their duties under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, responding to a scene where 3 young children had been murdered by their own father. In December, Jason Carroll's entered a plea. He pleaded guilty but mentally ill to all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The plea acknowledged that while he had a mental illness, he understood the difference between right and wrong at the time he committed the murders. Under Illinois law, this meant he would be sentenced to a regular prison but could be eligible to receive psychological services while incarcerated. The sentencing hearing took place on February 16, 2024. It was a day of reckoning for Carroll's and a day of profound grief for the family he had destroyed. Deborah Berg stood before the court and addressed the man who had murdered their children. She called him a monster, repeatedly. She spoke about Bryant, her eldest son, describing him as more of a man than his father would ever be. She talked about the lives that had been stolen, the futures that would never come to pass, the milestones she would never witness. Other family members also gave victim impact statements. The children's aunt and maternal grandmother echoed Berg's sentiments. They described the loss as a light going out in their lives. They spoke about the impossibility of comprehending how someone could do this to his own children, to babies who trusted him completely. When it was Carroll's turn to speak, he offered a brief apology. He acknowledged the pain he had caused, but added something that struck many in the courtroom as deeply disturbing. "God understands what was in my heart and what my intentions were," he said. "That will save me in the next life." The statement suggested that even after pleading guilty to drowning his 3 children, Carroll's believed he would be forgiven in some spiritual sense. He seemed to be seeking validation or absolution for an act that was beyond redemption. Judge James Borras, presiding over the sentencing, made his feelings clear. He described Carroll's actions as sickening and despicable. Under Illinois law, a natural life sentence is mandatory for the commission of more than 1 first-degree murder. Judge Borras sentenced Jason Carroll's to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carroll's assistant public defender, Molly Limeback, had argued that he was mentally ill at the time of the murders. While the guilty but mentally ill plea acknowledged this, it did not change the outcome. Carroll's would spend the rest of his life in prison, though he would potentially have access to mental health treatment during his incarceration. The case sent shockwaves through Round Lake Beach and beyond. The note Carroll's left made his motive explicit: revenge. He wanted to hurt Deborah Berg in the most devastating way possible, and he chose to do it by taking away the 3 people they both loved most. The children became collateral damage in a marital dispute, used as pawns in a game of cruelty and control. Experts in family violence pointed to the case as an example of a particularly dangerous dynamic. When one parent uses children as weapons against the other, the potential for tragedy increases dramatically. In Carol's mind, the children were not individuals with their own right to life. They were extensions of his relationship with Berg, and when that relationship ended, he saw them as tools for inflicting pain. The custody transition itself became a focal point for discussion. Berg had arrived at the home to pick up the children, a routine exchange that happens thousands of times every day across the country. But in this case, the transition became the moment when she discovered her worst nightmare. The children should have been safe in their father's care. Instead, he had turned their visit into a death sentence. Deborah Berg's life will never be the same. She lost all three of her children in a single, deliberate act of cruelty. Bryant would be 7 years old now, Cassidy would be 5, Gideon would be 4. Instead, they remain frozen in time, their lives cut short in a bathtub by the person who should have protected them. State's Attorney Eric Reinhart released a statement after the sentencing, emphasizing that while nothing could bring the children back, the sentence ensured that the family and community would be safe from Jason Carroll's forever. The dedication of the legal team and victim specialists who supported the family throughout the process was noted, as was the ongoing support the office would provide to the surviving family members. Today, Jason Carroll sits in the Illinois Department of Corrections, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. There is no parole. There is no release. The man who drowned his 3 children to hurt their mother, who left a note spelling out his revenge, will die in prison. The names Bryant, Cassidy, and Gideon Carroll stand as a reminder of 3 young lives stolen by rage and spite. Their story forces a difficult conversation about the dangers that can emerge during custody disputes, the warning signs that sometimes go unrecognized, and the importance of protecting children from becoming pawns in adult conflicts. For Berg and her family, the pain is permanent. "My 3 angels are putting their mother back together slowly but surely," she said during the sentencing. "But the process of healing from such a loss will last a lifetime, and the absence of those 3 children will be felt every single day." Case 4. Josh Powell. The supervised visit was supposed to be routine. On February 5, 2012, social worker Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived at a rental home in Graham, Washington, with 2 young boys in her care. Charlie Powell was 7 years old. Braden was 5. They were there to see their father, Joshua Powell, under court-ordered supervision. Hall had done this before. Supervised visitations were part of her job, ensuring that children could maintain contact with parents while protection measures remained in place. She understood the protocols. She knew to stay present, to monitor the interaction, to keep the children safe. But what happened in the next few minutes would haunt her forever. Josh Powell was waiting at the door. When Charlie and Braden arrived, they ran ahead excitedly toward their father, as children do. Powell grabbed both boys and pulled them quickly inside the house. Before Hall could follow them in, Powell slammed the door in her face and locked it. Hall immediately sensed danger. She tried the door, locked. She pounded on it, calling out. No response. Then she smelled gasoline. The odor was overwhelming, pouring from the house. Hall pulled out her phone and called 911. It was 12:08 p.m. She told the dispatcher that something was terribly wrong, that she had been locked out of a supervised visit, that she could smell gasoline. But the call was logged as routine rather than urgent. The response would not be immediate. Inside the house, Josh Powell had already set his plan in motion. He had struck both boys with a hatchet. Charlie suffered injuries to his neck. 5-year-old Braden sustained chop wounds to both his head and neck. The boys were wounded but still alive when Powell ignited the gasoline he had spread throughout the home. At 12:08 p.m., as Hall frantically tried to get help, the house exploded. The blast was massive. Flames engulfed the structure. Hall, still outside, could only watch in horror. By the time emergency responders arrived, the house was an inferno. There was nothing anyone could do. Charlie and Braden Powell died from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fire consumed them. Josh Powell died by suicide in the explosion he had created. The Pierce County Medical Examiner later confirmed what investigators suspected. Autopsies showed that the boys had been attacked with a hatchet before the fire started. The weapon was found in the charred debris. Both children had been injured, but were still breathing when the explosion occurred, meaning they died in the flames and smoke their father had deliberately set. The murder-suicide was the devastating conclusion to a case that had captured national attention for more than 2 years. In December 2009, Josh Powell's wife, Susan Cox Powell, disappeared from their home in West Valley City, Utah. She was 28 years old and the mother of Charlie and Braden. Josh claimed he had taken the boys on a spontaneous camping trip in the middle of a winter night, leaving Susan home because she was tired. When he returned the next day, Susan was gone. Law enforcement immediately found his story suspicious. Who takes 2 small children camping in freezing temperatures in the middle of the night? Susan's friend said she would never have allowed it. Investigators named Josh Powell a person of interest in her disappearance, but they never found enough evidence to charge him. Susan's body was never recovered. Her family believed Josh had killed her and hidden her remains. Before her disappearance, Susan had made a video stating she wanted their assets documented. She had written in a will, quote 1. After Susan's disappearance, Josh moved with Charlie and Braden to Washington to live with his father, Stephen Powell. In 2011, Stephen Powell was arrested on child pornography and voyeurism charges. Police searched his home and found disturbing videos he had secretly recorded of Susan, along with images of neighborhood children. With Stephen's arrest, child welfare authorities removed Charlie and Braden from the home and placed them with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. Josh Powell began a custody battle to regain his sons. The courts allowed supervised visitation while the case proceeded. But in his final court appearance days before the murders, a judge ordered Powell to undergo a psychosexual evaluation and a polygraph test. He was losing ground in the custody fight, and it was becoming clear he might never get his sons back. Chuck and Judy Cox had warned authorities that Josh was capable of harming the children. They told caseworkers, psychologists, police, and attorneys involved in the case that if Josh felt cornered, if he was going to lose custody or face arrest, he might kill the boys and himself. Their warnings were documented. But the supervised visitation continued. On the morning of February 5th, before the visit, Josh Powell sent emails to family members detailing instructions for his finances, his house utilities, and other aspects of his life. He gave away the children's toys to Goodwill in the days before. He left a voicemail message saying, quote 2, just before the explosion, he sent his attorney an email that read simply, quote 3, every action suggested he had planned exactly what he was going to do. Elizabeth Griffin Hall's 911 call became a central piece of evidence in understanding how the system failed. She made that first call at 12:08 p.m., reporting that she had been locked out and smelled gasoline. But the call was not treated as an emergency. By the time responders arrived, the house had exploded and everyone inside was dead. The Cox family was devastated. They had custody of the boys. They had been trying to protect them. They had warned everyone who would listen that Josh Powell was dangerous. And yet their grandsons had been sent to a supervised visit that became a death trap. In the aftermath, the Cox family pursued legal action. They sued Washington's Department of Social and Health Services and its social workers, arguing that the agency had prioritized Josh Powell's parental rights over the safety of Charlie and Braden. In 2019, after years of legal battles, a jury agreed. They awarded Chuck and Judy Cox $98 million, finding that the state had been negligent in failing to protect the boys. The trial revealed that Utah law enforcement had not shared critical evidence about Josh Powell with Washington investigators. The communication breakdown meant that Washington authorities did not have the full picture of how dangerous Powell was. A Washington state report concluded that more information from Utah might have changed the decisions made about the boy's custody and visitation. The case led to calls for reform in how supervised visitations are handled, particularly when the parent in question is a suspect in a violent crime. It raised questions about how much risk is acceptable when balancing parental rights against child safety, and it underscored the importance of communication between jurisdictions when families cross state lines. Chuck Cox spoke publicly about his grief and frustration. He said, "But the warnings were not enough to stop the supervised visit from taking place. Elizabeth Griffin Hall, the social worker who witnessed the horror unfold, carried her own trauma. She had done everything she could in those final moments, pounding on the door, calling 911, trying desperately to get inside. But she had been locked out while two young boys were attacked and burned alive just feet away from her." Josh Powell's brother Michael became a person of interest in Susan's disappearance, with police believing he may have helped Josh dispose of her body. In February 2013, almost exactly 1 year after the murder-suicide, Michael Powell jumped to his death from a parking structure. Their father, Stephen Powell, served time for his voyeurism conviction and was released in 2017. He died of heart problems in 2018. To this day, Susan Cox Powell's body has not been found. West Valley City Police closed their active investigation in 2013, stating they believe Josh killed Susan and that Michael helped conceal her remains. But without a body, without a confession, the full truth of what happened to Susan remains unknown. Charlie and Braden Powell should be young men now. Charlie would be in his late teens. Braden would be nearly an adult. Instead, their lives ended in flames and smoke at ages 7 and 5, killed by their father during what was supposed to be a safe, supervised visit. The Powell case remains one of the most disturbing examples of family annihilation in recent American history. It combines multiple failures: a mother who disappeared and was never found, a father who was never charged but remained the prime suspect, a custody system that continued allowing contact despite clear warnings, and a murder-suicide that unfolded while a social worker stood helpless outside a locked door. For Chuck and Judy Cox, the pain is compounded. They lost their daughter Susan, who they believe was murdered. Then they lost their grandsons, who they had fought to protect. The $98 million judgment acknowledged that the system failed Charlie and Braden, but no amount of money can bring them back or ease the knowledge that their deaths might have been prevented if the warnings had been heeded. Case 5. Michael Wayne Jones. In the fall of 2019, a car crash in Georgia exposed one of the most horrific family annihilation cases Florida had seen in years. When authorities responded to the accident, they discovered something far worse than a traffic incident. Inside the vehicle was the body of Casey Jones. Nearby in suitcases and storage totes were the bodies of her 4 children. Michael Wayne Jones had been driving across state lines with his dead family. The children ranged in age from just 11 months to 9 years old. Cameron Bowers was 9, Preston Bowers was 5, Mercalli Jones was 2. Ayanna Jones was barely a year old. All 4 had been murdered by their father, stuffed into luggage, and transported like cargo as Jones attempted to flee. The investigation quickly traced the crimes back to Marion County, Florida, where the family had lived. What had started as a domestic dispute between husband and wife had escalated into the methodical murder of 4 innocent children. Jones claimed that Casey had come at him with a baseball bat during a fight. According to his account, she was killed in that confrontation. For that crime, he would eventually be sentenced to life in prison. But the murder of his wife was only the beginning. After killing Casey, Michael Wayne Jones made a decision. Rather than call for help, rather than stop, he turned his violence on the children. One by one, he murdered Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Ayanna. The oldest was 9. The youngest wasn't even walking yet. Jones then loaded the children's bodies into suitcases and storage totes. He placed Cassé's body in the vehicle, and he started driving north, leaving Marion County behind and heading toward Georgia. His plan, as far as investigators could determine, was to run, to get away from Florida, away from the crime scene, away from the life he had destroyed. But the crash changed everything. When Georgia authorities arrived at the accident scene and discovered the bodies, the full scope of Jones's crimes became immediately apparent. He was arrested on the spot. There would be no escape. Marion County authorities worked with Georgia investigators to piece together what had happened. The timeline was horrific. Jones had killed his wife, then systematically murdered each of their 4 children. He had taken the time to conceal their bodies in luggage. He had loaded everything into the car and driven for hours before the crash exposed what he had done. Michael Wayne Jones was extradited back to Florida to face charges. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with other related offenses. The prosecution faced a complex case. While Jones had killed Cassé in what he claimed was a domestic dispute, the murders of the 4 children were harder for him to explain away. There was no claim of self-defense for killing a 9-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and an infant. As the case moved forward, details about Jones's background emerged. His defense team argued that he had suffered mental illness and had endured significant abuse during his own childhood. They presented evidence of his troubled past, hoping to convince the court that these factors should be considered in sentencing. The goal was to save him from the death penalty. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Jones's actions were deliberate and methodical. He hadn't just killed in the heat of the moment. He had murdered 4 children, concealed their bodies, and attempted to flee across state lines. Every action suggested planning and intent. In the end, Michael Wayne Jones chose to plead guilty rather than face a jury trial. The plea deal was structured in 2 parts. For the murder of his wife Cassé, he received a sentence of life in prison. For the murders of Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Ayanna, the stakes were higher. The penalty phase proceeded with the jury tasked with deciding whether Jones should receive life in prison or the death penalty for each of the 4 children's murders. In January 2023, after hearing testimony about the crimes and considering both aggravating and mitigating factors, the jury reached a unanimous decision. They recommended that Michael Wayne Jones be sentenced to death for each of the 4 murders. On April 28, 2023, Judge Anthony Tatty presided over the formal sentencing hearing. Jones was asked if he had anything to say on his behalf. "No, Your Honor," he replied. Judge Tatty then handed down the sentences. "The court hereby adjudicates the defendant guilty on each count," he said. Following the jury's recommendation, he sentenced Michael Wayne Jones to death for the murders of Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Ayanna. Prosecutor Rich Buxman released a statement after the sentencing. Quote, 2, he said. Quote, 3. The case had required an enormous amount of time and effort from the legal team, especially during the holiday season when much of the penalty phase proceedings took place. Buxman expressed gratitude to the jurors who had devoted their time to carefully considering the evidence and making such a difficult decision. The sentencing meant that Michael Wayne Jones joined Florida's death row, where he would remain while the lengthy appeals process played out. Under Florida law, death penalty cases automatically receive appeals, a process that can take years or even decades. For the surviving family members, the sentencing brought some closure, though nothing could undo the loss. Cassé Jones's family had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother to 4 children. Cameron and Preston Bauer's extended family mourned the boys who would never grow up. Mercalli and Ayanna Jones, still babies, were gone before they had a chance to experience life. The case highlighted the deadly intersection of domestic violence and child endangerment. Jones's history of violence, mental illness, and childhood trauma had been documented. But the systems meant to identify and intervene in families at risk had not prevented the tragedy. By the time authorities discovered what Jones had done, it was already too late. The detail that Jones had placed the children's bodies in suitcases and storage totes struck investigators and the public as particularly disturbing. It spoke to a level of detachment and calculation. These were not the actions of someone overcome by emotion in a single moment. Jones had taken the time to conceal each small body, to pack them away, to load them into the car as if preparing for a trip. The crash in Georgia, while traumatic, became the event that exposed the crimes. Had Jones not been in that accident, had he successfully continued driving, the bodies might not have been discovered for days or weeks. The timeline would have been different, the investigation more complex. In a perverse way, the crash ended Jones's attempt to escape accountability. Marion County, where the murders took place, was left to grapple with the horror that had occurred within its borders. The community struggled to understand how a father could murder 4 children, ranging from an infant to a 9-year-old. There were no easy answers, only the grim reality that Jones had made a choice to kill not just his wife, but every one of his children. Today, Michael Wayne Jones sits on Florida's death row, awaiting the outcome of his appeals. The legal process will continue for years. But the outcome of his case is certain. He will never walk free. Whether he is ultimately executed or dies of natural causes in prison, he will spend the remainder of his life in custody. Cameron Bowers would be a teenager now. Preston would be in elementary school. Mercalli would be learning to talk in full sentences. Ayanna would be taking her first steps, speaking her first words. Instead, all 4 are gone, their futures stolen by the person who should have protected them above all others. The case stands as one of Florida's most shocking family annihilation cases, a reminder that domestic violence can escalate to unthinkable extremes. For the families left behind, for the community that watched the case unfold, and for the investigators who had to process the scene in Georgia, the scars remain. The image of those suitcases and storage totes containing the bodies of 4 children is one that cannot be erased. Case 6, John Emil List. The 19-room Victorian mansion known as Breeze Knoll stood at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. It was an impressive home, the kind that suggested success and stability. In November 1971, it became the scene of one of the most methodical family annihilations in American history. John Emil List was 46 years old, an accountant by profession, and a devout Lutheran who taught Sunday school. To his neighbors and community, he appeared to be a religious, disciplined family man. He lived in the mansion with his elderly mother, his wife, and their 3 teenage children. But behind the facade of respectability, List was drowning. His financial situation had deteriorated to crisis levels. He had accumulated more than $200,000 in debt, a staggering sum in 1971. He had lost his job months earlier, but hadn't told his family. Each morning he left the house as if going to work, spending his days at the train station, reading newspapers. His mother's medical bills were mounting. The mortgage on Breeze Knoll was becoming impossible to maintain. Everything was collapsing around him, and List saw no way out. But it wasn't just financial pressure that consumed List. He had become increasingly obsessed with religion and convinced himself that his family was straying from their faith. His wife Helen struggled with alcoholism and the effects of untreated syphilis from a previous marriage. His daughter Patricia, at 16, had expressed interest in pursuing acting, which List viewed as immoral. His sons were becoming more independent, less interested in the strict religious structure he demanded. In List's mind, A terrible logic began to take shape. He believed his family was destined for hell if they continued down their current paths. And if they died now, before they sinned further, he could save their souls. He convinced himself that murdering them would be an act of mercy. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List began systematically killing his family. He started with his wife, Helen. He shot her in the back of the head in the kitchen while she was having coffee. She died instantly. List then went upstairs to the third floor, where his 84-year-old mother, Alma, lived in her own apartment within the house. He shot her as well. He returned downstairs and waited. His daughter, Patricia, would be home from school first. When she arrived that afternoon, List shot the 16-year-old. He dragged her body to the ballroom and laid it out carefully. His sons, Frederick and John Jr., arrived home later. List called each boy individually as they entered the house. He shot 13-year-old Frederick, then 15-year-old John Jr. He moved both bodies to the ballroom, arranging them next to their sister and mother. His mother's body remained upstairs. With all 5 family members dead, List began an elaborate staging of the scene. He placed his wife and 3 children on sleeping bags in the ballroom, positioning them carefully. He turned on the intercom system and set it to play classical music throughout the house, creating an eerie soundtrack to the death scene. He left lights on in various rooms to suggest the family was still present. He wrote letters to his pastor and others explaining what he had done and why. List's justification was chilling in its calculated nature. In a letter left at the scene, he claimed he had killed his family because of financial problems and a sense that his children were becoming immoral and less religious. He wrote that he believed he had saved their souls by killing them before they could sin further. By his logic, his own damnation through murdering them would be worth it if it meant they could go to heaven. After arranging everything, John List cleaned himself up, gathered some belongings, and walked out of Breeze Knoll. He drove away from Westfield and simply disappeared. The bodies were not discovered for nearly a month. The classical music played continuously. The lights stayed on. Neighbors eventually noticed that no one had seen the List family. Mail piled up. Finally, on December 7, 1971, police entered the home and found the grim scene in the ballroom. By then, John List had a month's head start. He had assumed a new identity and vanished into America. The investigation went cold. Years passed with no credible leads. List resurfaced in Colorado, then later in Virginia, living under the name Robert Peter Clark. He remarried. He worked as an accountant. He attended church. He built an entirely new life while his real identity remained hidden. For nearly 18 years, List lived as a free man while wanted for 5 murders. The case might have remained unsolved indefinitely if not for the television program. Quote Bexty Bard. In 1989, the show decided to feature the List case. But there was a problem. No one knew what List looked like after 18 years. He would be in his mid-60s by then, and age would have changed his appearance significantly. The show's producers commissioned forensic sculptor Frank Bender to create an age-progressed bust showing what List might look like in 1989. Bender studied photographs from 1971 and used his understanding of how faces age to create a remarkably accurate representation. When the episode aired on May 21, 1989, the bust was shown to millions of viewers. Within days, someone who knew Robert Clark in Virginia recognized the resemblance. A tip was called in to authorities. On June 1, 1989, nearly 18 years after the murders, FBI agents arrested John List at his workplace in Virginia. He was 63 years old, living with his second wife, who had no idea of his true identity or past. When confronted, List initially denied who he was, but fingerprints confirmed his identity. List was extradited to New Jersey to face trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The bodies had been found in his home. The letters he left explained his actions. There was no question he had committed the murders. His trial in 1990 focused on whether he was legally insane at the time of the killings. The defense argued that List's extreme religious beliefs and financial desperation had made him mentally ill. But prosecutors countered that List's methodical planning, his careful staging of the scene, and his successful evasion for 18 years all demonstrated he knew right from wrong. During testimony, List showed little emotion. He spoke about the murders in a detached, matter-of-fact way. He claimed he had no choice, that he was trying to protect his family's eternal souls. When asked about the 18 years he spent living under a false identity, he offered no real explanation for how he had justified continuing his own life after claiming his family's deaths were necessary. The jury rejected the insanity defense. On April 12, 1990, John List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, he made a statement attempting to deflect responsibility. He said he felt that because of his mental state at the time, he was unaccountable for what happened. He asked for forgiveness, understanding, and prayer. Judge William Lura was not swayed. He called List's statement an attempt to avoid responsibility. The judge noted that after 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it was time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. to rise from the grave. He imposed 5 consecutive life sentences, meaning List would have to serve a minimum of 125 years before being eligible for parole. At age 64, the sentence was effectively life without parole. John List was sent to prison, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. He gave occasional interviews, always maintaining his religious justification for the murders. He never expressed genuine remorse for killing his family, only regret that his own life had been ruined as a consequence. On March 21, 2008, John List died in prison at the age of 82. He had spent nearly 18 years as a fugitive and 19 years incarcerated. His second wife, who had known him only as Robert Clark and learned the truth only after his arrest, divorced him. The List case became one of the most studied examples of family annihilation. The combination of financial desperation, religious obsession, and narcissistic personality traits created a deadly mix. List believed he was the ultimate authority over his family's fate, empowered by his twisted interpretation of faith to decide who lived and who died. The role of Quote One in solving the case highlighted the power of media in law enforcement. The forensic bust created by Frank Bender was so accurate that multiple people who knew List as Robert Clark recognized him immediately. The show's broadcast led directly to his capture, bringing closure to a case that had haunted investigators for nearly 2 decades. The mansion at Breeze Knoll, where the murders took place, was eventually torn down. The site became a symbol of the horror that had occurred there, and no one wanted to live in a house with such a dark history. For the extended family members who survived, the loss was compounded by the knowledge that List had lived freely for so long. He had built a new life, remarried, attended church, and continued as if he had not murdered 5 people. The fact that he had hidden successfully for nearly 2 decades seemed to mock the memory of his victims. Patricia List was 16 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, with dreams of becoming an actress. Frederick was 13, John Jr. was 15, both boys in their early teens with their whole lives ahead of them. Helen List, despite her struggles with addiction and illness, was only 45. Alma List was 84, living out what should have been peaceful final years with her family. All 5 were stolen from the world by a man who claimed he was saving them. John List's religious justification fooled no one in the end. He was not a savior. He was a murderer who chose the coward's path, unwilling to face his failures, unwilling to ask for help, unwilling to let his family make their own choices. The List case remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of rigid thinking, financial pressure, and the toxic combination of shame and control. It reminds us that the most dangerous people are sometimes those who believe they are acting for righteous reasons, who convince themselves that unthinkable acts are justified by some higher purpose. John List is gone now, but the memory of what he did lives on. And somewhere in heaven, we might hope, 5 voices finally rose from their sleeping bags in that ballroom, free at last from the man who claimed he was saving them. Case 7, Carlos Tercero Cruz. On May 23, 2015, the El Mirage Fire Department received a call about an unresponsive 3-year-old child at a home in Surprise, Arizona. When first responders arrived, they found a little girl who was cold, pale, and not breathing. Despite their attempts to save her, she could not be revived. When hospital staff examined the child's body, they were confronted with evidence of prolonged, systematic torture. The girl weighed only 16 pounds. At 3 years old, she should have weighed more than twice that amount. Her bones were nearly translucent, a sign of severe, prolonged malnutrition. Her body was covered in scars, open lesions, bruising, and swelling. There were ligature marks on her ankles where she had been restrained. According to the Maricopa County Medical Examiner, the cause of death was a combination of blunt force injuries, starvation, dehydration, and methamphetamine toxicity. The child had been beaten, starved, denied water, and exposed to drugs. Every system in her small body had been shutting down. The child's father was Carlos Tercero Cruz, born in April 1987. He lived in the Surprise home with his girlfriend, Rosemary Velasco, who was the child's mother. Both would ultimately face charges for what they had done to the little girl. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse that had lasted for months. This was not a single incident of violence. It was sustained torture of a defenseless child who depended entirely on the adults around her for survival. Surprise police arrested Cruz shortly after the child's death. When questioned, he initially tried to claim the injuries were from multiple falls, but the evidence told a different story. The pattern of injuries, the extreme malnutrition, the ligature marks, all of it pointed to deliberate, ongoing abuse. Police discovered a cell phone video that captured part of what the child had endured. In the video, Cruz told Velasco to deny the girl food. The casual cruelty of the instruction, captured on camera, showed how normalized the abuse had become in that household. The child had suffered from the 2 people who should have protected her most. Her father inflicted the violence. Her mother participated in the neglect and abuse. Neither intervened to save her. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the full scope of the horror became clear. The girl had been systematically starved until her bones became visible through translucent skin. She had been beaten repeatedly, leaving her body covered in injuries at various stages of healing. She had been restrained, with ligature marks showing she had been tied at the ankles. And at some point, she had been exposed to methamphetamine, the drug entering her system and contributing to her death. Hospital staff who examined her body reported that she had the lowest blood sugar level they could measure. Her organs were failing. Her body had been consuming itself, trying desperately to survive on no nutrition. By the time she arrived at the hospital, there was nothing medical science could do. Rosemary Velasco was charged first. In 2018, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and other charges. She was sentenced to natural life in prison plus 59 consecutive years. The sentence ensured she would never walk free. Carlos Tercero Cruz faced trial later. He was charged with first-degree murder, a Class 1 felony and dangerous crime against children. He was also charged with child abuse, a Class 2 felony, kidnapping, a Class 2 felony, and 3 additional counts of child abuse, Class 4 felonies. All charges carried the designation of dangerous crimes against children and domestic violence offenses. In March, a jury convicted Cruz of all charges. The evidence presented at trial was overwhelming. Medical testimony detailed the extent of the child's suffering. Photographs showed her emaciated body, the scars and lesions covering her skin, the evidence of prolonged abuse. The cell phone video demonstrated the casual cruelty with which food was denied to a starving child. The defense had no real answer to the mountain of evidence. There was no way to explain away a 3-year-old weighing 16 pounds with translucent bones and a body covered in injuries. There was no innocent explanation for ligature marks on a toddler's ankles or methamphetamine in her system. At sentencing, Carlos Tercero Cruz was given natural life in prison plus 57 years. Like Velasco, he would never be released. The message from the court was clear. What he had done to his daughter was beyond redemption. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell announced the sentencing, emphasizing that the little girl had died as a result of sustained torture by the two people responsible for caring for her. The case represented one of the most extreme examples of child abuse the county had prosecuted. The case raised difficult questions about how such prolonged abuse could go undetected. The child's condition would have been visible to anyone who saw her. At 16 pounds, she would have appeared skeletal, clearly malnourished, yet no one intervened in time to save her. It's possible the family was isolated, that the child was kept hidden from neighbors, teachers, or other mandatory reporters who might have noticed and called authorities. It's possible people saw signs but didn't report them. The investigation focused on the perpetrators, but lingering questions remained about whether earlier intervention could have prevented her death. The physical evidence documented at the time of death told the story of months of suffering. The scars and lesions at various stages of healing showed repeated injuries over time. The extreme malnutrition didn't happen overnight. It took weeks or months of sustained starvation to reduce a 3-year-old to 16 pounds. The ligature marks suggested she had been restrained repeatedly or for extended periods. Every piece of evidence pointed to a child who had been tortured systematically by the people who should have loved and protected her. The methamphetamine toxicity added another dimension to the horror. Whether the child was exposed to the drug through secondhand smoke, contaminated surfaces, or deliberate administration, the presence of meth in her system showed that Cruz and Velasco were using drugs in the home where they were starving and beating a 3-year-old. Child abuse experts who reviewed the case noted that it represented an extreme on the spectrum of parental violence. Most child abuse cases, while tragic, don't reach the level of prolonged torture that this child endured. The combination of starvation, repeated beatings, restraint, and drug exposure showed a complete absence of parental instinct or human compassion. Today, both Carlos Tercero Cruz and Rosemary Velasco are serving their sentences in Arizona state prisons. Cruz will die in custody. Velasco will die in custody. Neither will ever have another opportunity to harm a child. The little girl's name has been withheld from most public records, a small protection of her dignity after everything she endured. She died at 3 years old, having spent much of her short life suffering at the hands of her parents. She never had the chance to go to school, to make friends, to experience childhood. Her life was defined by hunger, pain, and fear. Cases like this force society to confront uncomfortable truths about child abuse. They remind us that the most dangerous place for some children is their own home. They underscore the importance of mandatory reporting, of neighbors paying attention, of systems that can intervene when children are at risk. But they also reveal the limitations of those systems. Even with laws in place, even with mandatory reporters and child protective services, some children slip through the cracks. Some abuse happens behind closed doors, hidden from view until it's too late. The sentencing of Carlos Tercero Cruz to natural life plus 57 years ensures he will answer for what he did to his daughter for the rest of his life. The prison where he sits represents society's judgment on his actions. But no sentence can undo the suffering inflicted on a 3-year-old girl who weighed 16 pounds when she died, whose bones had become translucent from starvation, whose body bore the marks of months of torture. Her life mattered. Her death demands we do better at protecting the most vulnerable among us. And the permanent incarceration of her killers stands as a statement that such cruelty will not be tolerated, even when it comes from a parent toward their own child. Case 8. Robert Fisher. On the morning of April 10, 2001, neighbors in a quiet Scottsdale, Arizona neighborhood were jolted awake by a massive explosion. The home at 2223 North 74th Place had erupted in flames. Fire crews rushed to the scene, battling a blaze so intense it would take hours to bring under control. When firefighters finally entered the charred remains of the house, they discovered 3 bodies. Mary Fisher, 38, had been shot in the head and her throat had been slit. Her 2 children, 13-year-old Brittany and 10-year-old Robert Jr., had both had their throats cut. All 3 had been killed before the explosion occurred. The family dog was found locked in a cage, alive, and Robert William Fisher, the husband and father, was nowhere to be found. Investigators quickly determined that the explosion had been deliberately set. Someone had cut the natural gas line in the house, allowing gas to fill the home before igniting it. The intent was clear: destroy the crime scene and any evidence it might contain. The massive blast had nearly succeeded, but not quite. Robert Fisher was 39 years old, a Navy veteran who worked as a surgical catheter technician. To neighbors, the Fishers appeared to be a typical suburban family, but those who knew them better described a different dynamic. Robert was controlling and demanding. The marriage had shown signs of strain. Mary had reportedly talked about leaving, though whether she had taken concrete steps toward divorce remained unclear. On the night of April 9th or early morning of April 10th, Robert Fisher killed his wife and children. The methods were brutal and personal. He shot Mary in the head, then slit her throat. He killed Brittany and Robert Jr. by cutting their throats as well. Then he set about staging the house for destruction. Fisher locked the family dog in its cage, perhaps an indication that, even in his violence, he drew some line at killing the animal. He cut the gas line and left the house. When enough gas had accumulated, the explosion tore through the structure, sending flames and debris into the air. By the time investigators began piecing together what happened, Robert Fisher had hours of head start. His truck, a 4x4 Toyota, was found days later in the Tonto National Forest, about 100 miles north of Scottsdale. The vehicle had been parked in a remote area and abandoned, but there was no sign of Fisher himself. The FBI joined the investigation almost immediately. The nature of the crime, the apparent planning involved, and Fisher's disappearance suggested he had fled and might cross state lines. In June 2002, more than a year after the murders, Robert Fisher was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. The manhunt that followed would become one of the longest in FBI history. Tips poured in from across the country. Alleged sightings came from multiple states. Each lead was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Fisher was an outdoorsman, experienced in wilderness survival from his time in the Navy. Investigators theorized he might have disappeared into the forest, using his skills to live off the land. But searches of the Tonto National Forest and surrounding areas found no trace of him. No campsite, no remains, nothing. Another theory suggested Fisher had committed suicide in the wilderness, and his body simply hadn't been found. The rugged terrain of the Tonto National Forest could easily conceal human remains. Animals and the elements would scatter and destroy evidence over time. A third possibility, one that kept the investigation active for 2 decades, was that Fisher had successfully fled and was living under a new identity somewhere in the United States or abroad. His Navy background suggested discipline and planning capability. Perhaps he had prepared for this outcome stashing money or documents that would allow him to disappear. Years passed. The investigation continued, but leads grew cold. The case was featured on television programs, including, quote, bringing renewed public attention periodically, but no confirmed sightings ever materialized. In 2021, 20 years after the murders, the FBI made a significant decision. Robert Fisher was removed from the 10 most wanted fugitives list. The decision didn't mean the case was closed or that authorities believed Fisher was innocent. Rather, it reflected a change in investigative strategy. The FBI explained that advances in technology and analytical techniques meant the resources dedicated to keeping Fisher on the list could be better used elsewhere. Local authorities in Arizona would continue investigating, and federal resources remained available if needed. The decision sparked debate. Some saw it as an admission that Fisher was likely dead, and had been for years. Others worried it meant the case would fade from public memory, reducing the chances of someone recognizing Fisher if he was still alive. For Mary Fisher's family, for Brittany and Robert Jr.'s extended relatives, the lack of closure has been agonizing. They know what happened to their loved ones. They know who killed them. But they don't know where Robert Fisher is or what became of him. The case raised questions about family annihilation and the profile of men who kill their entire families. Fisher fit certain patterns. He was controlling, reportedly unhappy in his marriage, and facing potential divorce. The murders took place in the family home, a location that gave him control and privacy. The use of extreme violence, followed by the attempt to destroy evidence through the explosion, suggested both rage and calculation. But Fisher's successful disappearance set him apart from most family annihilators. Many kill themselves at the scene or shortly after. Some, like John List, flee and build new lives, but are eventually caught. Robert Fisher did neither, at least as far as anyone knows. He simply vanished. Scottsdale Police and the FBI have maintained that the case remains open. Physical evidence was preserved. DNA samples exist. If Fisher's remains are found or if he is captured alive, modern forensic techniques could confirm his identity. The advancement of DNA technology since 2001 means even partial remains could potentially be identified. Investigators have also suggested that if Fisher is alive and living under an assumed identity, he would now be in his early 60s. Age changes appearance, but certain characteristics remain. He had a distinctive surgical scar on his lower back. Anyone with information about his whereabouts was urged to come forward. The question of whether Robert Fisher is alive or dead may never be answered definitively. If he died in the wilderness in 2001, his remains could have been scattered by animals or buried by natural processes. The Tonto National Forest covers hundreds of thousands of acres of rugged terrain. Finding a single person's remains, even with dedicated searches, borders on impossible. If he's alive, he has managed to evade detection for more than 2 decades. He would have needed to avoid any situation that required official identification. No driver's license, no banking under his real name, no medical records that could be traced. It's possible, but it requires constant vigilance and isolation. The explosion that destroyed the Fisher home on April 10, 2001, was meant to erase evidence. Instead, it drew immediate attention and led to a rapid investigation. The bodies of Mary, Brittany, and Robert Jr. were recovered. The cause of death was determined. The perpetrator was identified. In that sense, Fisher's attempt to cover his tracks failed. But in another sense, it succeeded. The explosion, the abandoned truck, the vast wilderness, and Fisher's disappearance created enough confusion and enough possibilities that certainty remains elusive. Did he die in the forest days after the murders? Did he successfully flee to another country? Is he living under an assumed name somewhere in America? No one knows. Today, the lot where the Fisher home once stood has been rebuilt. A new family lives there, likely unaware of or trying not to dwell on the tragedy that occurred on that ground more than 2 decades ago. Mary Fisher was 38 years old, a mother to 2 children who were just beginning their teenage years. Brittany was 13, navigating middle school and looking toward high school. Robert Jr. was 10, still in elementary school with his whole life ahead of him. All 3 died at the hands of the husband and father who should have protected them. Robert William Fisher remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The manhunt for him lasted 2 decades as an active FBI priority and continues in a more limited capacity today. His face is still recognized by those who followed the case. His name still generates tips and theories. But whether he is alive somewhere, living with the knowledge of what he did, or whether his remains lie undiscovered in the Arizona wilderness, we may never know. The case of Robert Fisher stands as a reminder that some mysteries remain unsolved, some killers escape justice, and some families never get the closure they deserve. Somewhere, perhaps, Robert Fisher exists. Or perhaps he has been gone for more than 20 years, his body reclaimed by the desert he knew so well. Either way, Mary, Brittany, and Robert Jr. are gone. Their lives ended in violence in their own home, and their killer was never held accountable. Case 9. James Maimone III. James Maimone III and Marcia Eakin married in 1998 and had 2 children together, a daughter named Macy and a son named James IV. For a time, they were a family. But by 2008, the marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. That year, Maimone discovered his wife had contacted a lawyer about divorcing him. His response was threatening. He became verbally abusive and made statements that frightened Eakin enough that she obtained a protection order against him. Maimone was briefly jailed for violating the order through his verbal domestic violence. Eakin moved out with the children. In April 2009, their divorce was finalized. As part of the divorce agreement, Maimone was granted periodic evening and overnight visitations with Macy and James IV. The children were still young, both under the age of 5. During these visits, they would spend time with their father under the court-ordered custody arrangement. In 2009, during one of these visitation periods, James Maimone decided his children would not be returning to their mother. The details of what happened are as brutal as they are heartbreaking. Maimone placed Macy and James IV in their car seats, strapping them in as any parent would for a car ride. The children were secured, unable to move freely, completely dependent on their father for safety. Then, Maimone stabbed them to death. The children were helpless in their car seats, restrained by the very safety devices meant to protect them. They could not run. They could not fight back. They were trapped as their father attacked them with a knife. Maimone also murdered his ex-mother-in-law, though the specific circumstances of her death were less detailed in court records. The act suggested an attempt to strike at everyone connected to his former wife, to inflict maximum damage on the family he had once been part of. When authorities discovered the crime scene and began investigating, the evidence against Maimone was overwhelming. The children had been found in their car seats, stabbed to death. There was no question about who had been responsible for their care at the time. There was no alternative suspect. Maimone was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. The prosecution built a case that emphasized the particularly heinous nature of the crimes. These were not impulsive killings. Maimone had strapped his children into car seats, deliberately placing them in a position where they could not escape, and then murdered them. The trial included crime scene photographs of the children still in their car seats and autopsy photos showing the extent of their injuries. Maimone's defense attorneys objected to the admission of these photographs, arguing they were unnecessary because Maimone did not deny killing the children. The defense claimed the state could have proven the children's deaths and injuries through less graphic means. But Justice Judith Ann Lanzinger, writing for the Ohio Supreme Court in a later appeal, rejected this argument. She explained that the state had to prove Mamone purposely killed Macy and James IV. The photographs were necessary to establish the deliberate nature of the murders and to show the suffering inflicted. The value of the photos to the prosecution's case outweighed any potential prejudice to Mamone. The jury heard testimony about Mamone's behavior leading up to the murders, his threats toward his ex-wife, his verbal abuse, the protection order that had been issued, the divorce that had been finalized just months before, and the fact that these murders occurred during court-ordered visitation, a time when the children should have been safe with their father. The jury convicted James Mamone III of aggravated murder. The case then moved to the penalty phase, where jurors would decide whether he should receive the death penalty or life in prison. Prosecutors argued that the aggravating circumstances of the case warranted death. The victims were children. They were killed by their own father. They were restrained in car seats, making them particularly vulnerable. Multiple murders had been committed. The cruelty involved in stabbing children who could not escape their car seats demonstrated a level of depravity that deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense presented mitigating factors, arguing for life imprisonment instead. They raised issues of Mamone's mental state, his history, and factors they believed should spare him from execution. But the jury was not persuaded. James Mamone was sentenced to death. He appealed the conviction and sentence to the Ohio Supreme Court, raising multiple arguments. He claimed the trial had been tainted by harmful pretrial publicity, making it impossible to seat an impartial jury. He argued the gruesome crime scene photos should not have been admitted. He challenged the jury instructions and raised concerns about prosecutorial misconduct. The Ohio Supreme Court addressed each argument systematically. In a 6-1 decision issued in 2014, the court upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. Justice Lanzinger's opinion acknowledged the horrific nature of what Mamone had done. The court noted that the children were particularly vulnerable, strapped into car seats where they could not defend themselves. The murders of multiple victims, especially children, constituted aggravating circumstances that supported the death penalty. The court also conducted an independent review of the sentence as required in death penalty cases. They examined whether the evidence supported the jury's findings regarding aggravating circumstances, whether the mitigating factors had been properly considered, and whether the death sentence was appropriate and proportionate. The court concluded the sentence was justified. Only one justice dissented. In his separate opinion, Justice William O'Neill acknowledged the incomprehensible evil of Mamone's actions. Quote Zero O'Neill wrote, "Yet he maintained his position that the death penalty itself was unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment. He argued that life in prison without parole was the appropriate sentence, but his was a minority view based on principle rather than disagreement about the facts of the case. The case drew attention to the dangers that can emerge during custody transitions and visitations following divorce. The court orders that gave Mamone time with his children were based on the principle that children benefit from maintaining relationships with both parents. In the vast majority of cases, this principle serves children well, but in cases involving domestic violence, threats, and control issues, visitation can become an opportunity for tragedy. Mamone had shown warning signs: the verbal domestic violence, the threats, the protection order, yet the visitation continued, likely because courts are reluctant to completely sever parental rights without clear evidence of immediate danger to the children. In hindsight, the signs were there, but predicting which angry, threatening ex-spouse will actually harm their children versus which will eventually calm down and co-parent peacefully is an impossible task. The image of those children strapped in car seats, unable to escape as their father attacked them, became central to how the public understood the case. Car seats are symbols of parental care and protection. Parents carefully install them, follow safety guidelines, buckle their children in to keep them safe on the road. Mamoun perverted that protective instinct, using the restraints to make his children vulnerable and helpless. The murder of his ex-mother-in-law suggested his motive went beyond the children themselves. He was striking at his former wife through everyone she loved. He wanted to inflict maximum pain, to destroy her family as thoroughly as his own life had been disrupted by the divorce. Today, James Mamoun III sits on Ohio's death row, awaiting the outcome of further appeals. Death penalty cases move slowly through the legal system, often taking years or even decades from sentencing to execution. Ohio has not executed anyone since 2018 due to difficulties obtaining lethal injection drugs, adding further uncertainty to when or if Mamoun's sentence will be carried out. But whether he is ultimately executed or dies of natural causes in prison, James Mamoun will never be free. He will spend the remainder of his life in custody, paying for the murders of his children and his ex-mother-in-law. Macy and James IV Mamoun were robbed of their futures. They died during what should have been routine time with their father, a visitation arranged by the court to maintain their relationship with him. Instead, he strapped them into car seats and murdered them. Their deaths serve as a tragic reminder that the end of a marriage can bring out the worst in some people, and that children caught in the middle are devastatingly vulnerable. The systems meant to protect them, custody arrangements, visitation schedules, court oversight, can only do so much when a parent is determined to cause harm. For Marcia Eakin, the loss is incomprehensible. She lost both of her children and her mother in a single act of violence committed by the man she had once married. The divorce was supposed to end their relationship and allow everyone to move forward. Instead, it triggered a massacre that destroyed her family. The Ohio Supreme Court's decision to uphold Mamoun's death sentence reflected society's judgment that what he did was among the worst crimes imaginable. Murdering children is one thing. Murdering your own children is another level entirely. And murdering them while they sit helpless in car seats, restrained by safety devices, unable even to attempt escape, represents a degree of cruelty that pushes the crime into a category reserved for the most heinous acts. James Mamoun III will die for what he did, either by execution or by age. But his children are already gone, their small bodies found strapped in car seats, victims of the father who was supposed to protect them above all else. Case 10. Nicholas Wagoner, Browning. On the surface, Nicholas Browning appeared to have everything going for him. He was 15 years old, an honor student at Dulaney High School in Timonium, Maryland. He played varsity golf and lacrosse. He was a Boy Scout. He came from a stable, successful family. His father, John W. Browning, was an attorney. His mother, Tamara, was a homemaker who dedicated herself to raising Nicholas and his two younger brothers, Gregory, 13, and Benjamin, 11. The evening of Friday, February 1st, 2008, began normally enough. Nicholas was spending the night at a friend's house, a routine occurrence for a teenager his age. It was a week before his 16th birthday. Nothing suggested that within hours, 4 members of the Browning family would be dead. Sometime in the middle of the night, Nicholas left his friend's house. He drove back to his family's home in Cockeysville. Everyone was asleep. His father, mother, and 2 brothers were in their beds, unaware that Nicholas had returned. Nicholas retrieved a gun. Then, moving methodically through the house, he entered each bedroom and shot his sleeping family members. He killed his father John. He killed his mother Tamara. He killed 13-year-old Gregory. He killed 11-year-old Benjamin. After murdering his entire family, Nicholas left the house and drove back to his friend's home. He went inside and went to sleep as if nothing had happened. The next morning, the bodies were discovered. Law enforcement responded to the Browning home and found the grim scene. 4 people had been shot to death in their beds. The only family member unaccounted for was Nicholas, who was still at his friend's house. When police arrived to speak with Nicholas, He initially maintained his innocence, but the evidence quickly pointed to him. He had access to the home and the weapon. He had no alibi for the crucial hours when the murders occurred. And as investigators dug deeper, the facade of the perfect teenager began to crack. Nicholas Browning was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The question that haunted everyone who knew the family was simple and unanswerable. Why? Nicholas came from privilege. His father was a successful attorney. The family lived comfortably. Nicholas attended good schools, participated in extracurricular activities, and seemed to be thriving. There was no obvious history of abuse, no clear trigger, no apparent motive for such extreme violence, yet he had systematically executed his entire family while they slept. The case shocked the Cockeysville community. Neighbors, teachers, and friends struggled to reconcile the Nicholas they knew with what he had done. He was polite, accomplished, involved in activities that suggested strong character. Boy Scouts taught leadership and values. Varsity sports required discipline and teamwork. Academic success showed he was capable and intelligent. How does a teenager with such a promising future become a family annihilator? Prosecutors made the decision to try Nicholas as an adult rather than in the juvenile system. Given the severity of the crimes, 4 murders, including 2 children, and the calculated nature of the killings, they argued he should face adult consequences. The trial revealed some details about Nicholas's state of mind, though a complete explanation remained elusive. There were suggestions of family tensions beneath the surface, conflicts that outsiders hadn't seen. But nothing rose to the level that would explain or justify what he had done. Nicholas was convicted on all 4 counts of murder. The jury found him guilty of killing his father, mother, and 2 brothers. At sentencing, he received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case became the subject of a documentary on Investigation Discovery's series Killer Kids, which examined cases of juveniles who committed murder. The episode, titled Spoiled, Rotten, and Bad Dream, explored the Browning family murders and attempted to understand what could drive a 15-year-old from a privileged background to commit such acts. The documentary title suggested one theory, that Nicholas had been spoiled, given too much, and developed a sense of entitlement that made him unable to handle normal teenage conflicts with his parents. But this explanation felt insufficient for the enormity of what he had done. Many teenagers are spoiled. Very few murder their families. Another theory centered on the premeditated nature of the crime. Nicholas left his friend's house in the middle of the night, returned home, killed 4 people, and went back to his friend's house. This required planning and calculation. It wasn't an impulsive act of rage. He had time to think about what he was doing, time to stop himself, and he chose to continue. The detail that he returned to his friend's house after the murders suggested he believed he could get away with it. Perhaps he thought that being away from the home at the time of discovery would provide an alibi. Perhaps he simply wanted to delay the moment when his life would change forever. Either way, the act of going back to bed after murdering his family demonstrated a chilling ability to compartmentalize. For the extended Browning family, the loss was devastating and complicated. They had lost John, Tamara, Gregory, and Benjamin. But the killer was Nicholas, also a family member. Some relatives struggled with conflicting emotions, grief for the victims, and some residual care for the boy who had been part of their family before he became a murderer. The case highlighted the difficulty in predicting which teenagers might become violent. Nicholas had no obvious red flags. He wasn't failing in school. He wasn't isolated or visibly troubled. He participated in activities and seemed socially adjusted. If trained professionals and people who saw him daily couldn't spot the warning signs, how could anyone prevent such tragedies? Some experts suggested that the very perfectionism that made Nicholas successful might have played a role. The pressure to maintain his image as a model student and athlete, combined with typical teenage conflicts at home, might have created internal stress that he felt unable to manage. But again, many teenagers experience pressure, and they don't respond by murdering their families. The reality is that in some cases, we simply don't know why. Nicholas Browning's motive remains partially obscured. He killed his family with determination and planning, but the ultimate reason he chose that path remains unclear even after conviction. Today, Nicholas Browning is in his early 30s, serving multiple life sentences in a Maryland prison. The Boy Scout who once earned merit badges now spends his days in a cell. The honor student who played varsity sports will never attend college, never have a career, never build a life outside prison walls. John W. Browning was an attorney, a father who worked to provide for his family. Tamara Browning was a mother dedicated to raising her sons. Gregory and Benjamin were young teenagers just beginning to find their paths in life. All four died in their beds, killed by someone they trusted completely. The case of Nicholas Browning serves as a reminder that privilege and opportunity don't immunize families from violence, that success and achievement don't guarantee safety, that sometimes the greatest danger comes from within the home, from someone who seems least likely to cause harm. The week after February 1st, 2008, Nicholas Browning should have been celebrating his 16th birthday with his family. Instead, he had killed them all. The birthday came and went with Nicholas in custody, facing 4 murder charges. Whatever he had hoped to gain by killing his family, he had instead destroyed his own future along with theirs. The community of Cockeysville, the students at Dulaney High School, the Boy Scout troop Nicholas belonged to, all were left trying to understand how one of their own could commit such an act. The answers remain incomplete, the motives still partially hidden behind the facade of the perfect teenager who, on one February night, became something else entirely. These 10 fathers betrayed the most sacred trust imaginable. From Chad Doorman hunting his sons like prey, Josh Powell's explosive final act, each case reminds us that monsters don't always hide in shadows. They sometimes live in suburban homes, coach Little League, and smile in family photos. These children deserved protection, love, and futures full of possibility. Instead, they became casualties of rage, selfishness, and control. Their stories demand we ask ourselves, how do we spot the warning signs? How do we protect the vulnerable? And how do we honor these young lives by ensuring their deaths weren't in vain? Which of these cases shocked you the most? Do you think there were missed warning signs that could have prevented these tragedies? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe these stories need to be told to raise awareness, please like and subscribe to support this channel's mission of giving voices to victims.